Any effect you add to audio, including compression, is to sound what salt is to cooking. A dash might really enhance the stew, but if you add 10 tablespoons, now that dish is all about the salt and it's not about the stew. So the goal is to use compression without really calling attention to it. People should not go, "Oh, what good compression." They should just think your voice sounds great. The big studios have hardware compressors, but if you're listening to this at-home person, you're probably applying compression after you record by using your recording software's effects. In Audition, you choose effects, and then there's several different compressors to choose, but I recommend multi-band compression. In Audacity, choose Effects, Compressor. If you're recording in GarageBand 10, double-click at the head of a track, and you'll bring up Compressor. So I'm showing these various tools, and the point is that regardless of the tool, every compressor has threshold, ratio, attack, and most of them also have release. Once you know how to configure these 4 things, you can make beautiful compression. It is not too hard for you at all, so let's go into each of these specific items. In part 1 of this explanation, I said that compressors turn down the peaks. That begs the question, which part of this wave is the peak? Just the tippy top? The top half? Threshold is where you tell your compressor, here's where the peak begins. Every sound above this volume, treat it as the peak. Now, think about the last time you were at a theme park that had a good roller coaster. Usually somewhere there's a sign that says, must be this tall to go on this ride. That's how compression acts with audio. If the audio does not cross the threshold, it doesn't get to go on the compression ride. It only affects audio that goes above the threshold. So there's a practical tip in here for you. If you apply a compression effect and it seems like nothing happened, it's possible that your threshold is set so high that none of your sound wave triggered the compressor. Just look at your sound wave, figure out how tall it is, and then you can set your threshold based on how much of the wave you want to affect. All right, so now you have an idea of what threshold is and how you set it. Threshold means once audio volume crosses this line, I want the compressor to turn it down. How much will the compressor turn it down? That's ratio. Check out my chart here. Here is input. Let's say the input is your voice, and this line means that we're going higher in decibels. So here's the threshold, and here's output. So if the compressor is off, when sound crosses the threshold, nothing happens. You get however many decibels the sound has. So to say it more mathematically, for every 1 decibel of volume that crosses the threshold, you get 1 decibel of volume. That's a 1-to-1 ratio. If the compressor is on, now let's say we've set it at a 2-to-1 ratio. That means that once audio crosses the threshold, for every 2 decibels it would have gone over the line, the compressor allows 1. If the sound would have crossed this line by 12 decibels, a 2-to-1 ratio means divide by 2, you get 6 decibels over the line instead of 12. Let's say you set your ratio to 4-to-1. You're probably getting ahead of me, right? For every 4 decibels over the threshold, the compressor allows 1. So if I cross this line by 12 decibels and I'm at a 4-to-1 ratio, the compressor turns it down to 3 decibels over the line. The higher that ratio number, the more compression you're introducing. Is that good or bad? I don't know. It depends. Different things happen at different frequencies. But for an example of extreme compression, have you ever gone to a really loud concert where every time they hit the kick drum, you actually feel the air in your chest? That is a ton of compression on that kick drum, perhaps 20-to-1 ratio. But remember my analogy, compression's like salt. Add a little salt, yum. Add a whole box of salt, well, nobody wants to eat that food anymore. So for compressing a human voice, you want a pretty natural sound. Your ratio should be somewhere between 2-to-1 to 4-to-1. You can go higher, but if you do, listen carefully to make sure you're not introducing a kind of a fake overprocessed sound. And before you go past 4-to-1, it might mean that what you're doing is compressing the holy heck out of just the tip of the sound wave. Lower your threshold so that more of the wave is getting compressed. So you see there's a trade-off here. You want the threshold to tell how much of the wave is getting affected. You want the ratio to tell how hard it's getting affected. For a human voice, you don't need a really low threshold and really high compression. It just won't sound natural. As a starting point, try a threshold of -20 or so. Try a ratio of maybe 3:1. See what you think, and then play with the settings from there. Okay, quick review. Threshold means after you go this far, I'm turning you down. Ratio means after you go this far, here's how much I'm turning you down. Now let's add in attack. Attack means after you go this far, here's how fast I'm turning you down. So how do you specify whether you're slamming the door or easing the door on the volume? By specifying time measured in milliseconds in this field called attack. Your goal is transparency. We don't want to hear the compressor working. So if you set attack too slow, you'll hear the volume rise above the threshold, and then a split second later, the compressor will kick in and squash it back down. And so you kind of get this sound where it's getting loud and then it drops down, and it gets loud again and it drops down. That effect is called pumping and is considered undesirable because it calls attention to the compressor rather than your audio content. So a relatively fast attack helps the compressor kick in quickly so that we don't ever realize it has intervened, and that's good. So I would try 5 milliseconds as a default, but again, anything can be okay here as long as we don't hear the compressor working in a way that's distracting. Most compressors also add release as a setting. How fast should compression turn off once the sound falls back below the threshold? So again, just set this to any number where you don't hear the compressor working. For human speech, 100 milliseconds is not a bad starting point. Experiment with it. You've got a lot of latitude. You just don't want the compressor to do anything that's distracting. All right, that is my brief introduction to compression. There's much more to say about it, but honestly, you'll learn more faster if you just play with it. Record some audio or grab some audio, slap on some headphones, and just keep playing it back with different compression settings in your software. Now, I do recommend changing one setting at a time. If you adjust threshold and ratio and attack, and then you hear some sound, whether you like it or don't like it, you don't know which of those 3 settings contributed to that sound. So take one of them, like attack, and move it to extremes until the sound becomes obnoxious, then retreat back to what sounds good. And if you just dedicate yourself to doing this for a few minutes, you will become very familiar with what your compressor is doing in your particular setup of microphone and software and computer. So that's it. Thanks for joining me. I'm Scott Pinzon. Remember, it's not work if you love what you're doing, so give your audio some love.